Hello everybody, welcome to the Journalism in the Age of Trump panel sponsored by Edinboro Campus Media. This event which we are set to discuss how journalism has evolved throughout President Trump's first year of presidency, along with the cable news panel, the concept of fake news, and much more. My name is Dakota Palmer, and I'm a senior journalism and public relations major, as well as the executive editor of The Spectator, our student-run newspaper. I will be moderating our panel today, so now I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to ask that you hold your applause until I introduce all three of them. Janice Castro, in the middle, was a reporter and editor at Time Magazine for 26 years, and most recently a retired faculty member from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. She was the head of Time's interactive operations as assistant managing editor in new media for Time, supervising online news and community for the company's magazines such as People, Fortune, Entertainment Weekly, and Sports Illustrated. At Northwestern, she was the coordinator for News 21, a multimedia reporting collaboration by 12 universities funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the James L. Knight Foundation, and is part of the Carnegie Knight Initiative on the Future of Journalism. Kate Giammarese, right next to me, covers poverty and social services for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. She spent 3 years covering state government politics in the newspaper's State Capitol Bureau in Harrisburg. Before that, she worked at the Toledo Blade covering poverty issues after beginning her journalism career at newspapers in Ohio. She's received numerous journalism awards, including a 2017 Kiplinger Fellowship at The Ohio State University. And last but not least, Kevin Flowers, on the end, has been a reporter at the Erie Times News for 28 years. He currently covers city government and has been responsible for extensive enterprise and investigative reporting on various subjects. In the past, he was a winner of the National Headliner and IRE Awards for investigative reporting. In 2017, the Northwestern Pennsylvania chapter of the PRSA named him the organization's Print Journalist of the Year. So today I'd like to start with questions for each individual, but the other panelists, please feel free to weigh in. Okay, the first question is for Kate. Given your covered topics like poverty, assistance programs, subjects of that nature, have you noticed a change in morale from your interviewees since President Trump was elected into office?
Well, so yeah, given the subjects that I cover is a lot of safety net programs and, assistance type programs like food stamps and Medicaid and assisted housing. Certainly, because of policy proposals that the Trump administration has, mostly at this point, I would say just that are in the proposal stage. Most of the advocacy groups that I interview have a lot of concerns about those proposals and the, cuts that have been proposed to those safety net programs.
Okay. Janice. If you were still in the classroom, how would you use President Trump's fake news accusations and the environment surrounding the White House as teaching tools for your journalism students? And how do you think current-day journalism teachers should be using this environment?
Well, I'm happy to say that I've actually been talking to some of the current-day journalism professors, and they're using, this is how I would do what they're doing. I would use it as a teachable moment. When you talk about fake news, the first thing any citizen should be able to do is discern the difference between fake news and something legitimate. But it's particularly important for college students and journalism students to understand the difference. So I think that we would probably be expanding the news literacy efforts that we were just starting to make at Medill when I was teaching there a few years ago.
Thank you. Kevin, how has the last presidential election changed the way you personally cover politics, particularly since Erie went red in the presidential election for the first time in the last 30 years?
Well, I've covered a lot of elections in, like you said, 28 years. So I think one of the things that 2016 taught a lot of us, including people that were veterans that had been around for a long time, was that things are unexpected. That you may think that you know exactly what the factors at play are in terms of, and I did a story on this in terms of why Erie County went red and what some of the factors were. You think you've seen a lot, you think you've seen it all, but you really haven't. So what you have to do is you have to kind of drill down and go and talk to people about what was it about the Trump message that resonated with you, or that resonated with certain voters, and why, when you look at Erie, you see a community that has, I hate to go into that stereotypical Rust Belt city kind of narrative, but there are a lot of economic losses. There's an efforts to kind of remake ourselves as a community in terms of what our economic development and job futures are going to be. So there are a lot of disenfranchised and frankly confused people out there who are either looking for jobs, who are in poverty, who are struggling. And what you have to do when you get a victory like that surprised a lot of people is you really, like I said, you have to drill down and go out and talk to people about why this might have happened, and again, why that message resonated with certain voters.
Can I just add? I mean,
Sure.
I do think like there's been a lot of soul searching among journalists, and
Absolutely.
that just we shouldn't make. We already shouldn't be making assumptions, but like definitely doubly so.
Absolutely.
We shouldn't be making assumptions.
I was just going to say, Kate, you probably saw a lot of what Kevin saw too, because Pittsburgh is the manufacturing city. So how, in that aspect, was what Kevin's saying resonating with people from Pittsburgh in that aspect?
You mean in terms of voters?
Yes.
Well, just to be clear, the city of Pittsburgh itself and Allegheny County, voted for Hillary Clinton, and but certainly, obviously, the area around all those counties are red. But yeah, I mean, just to Kevin's point, I think there was a lot of people second guessing ourselves and wondering if we paid enough attention to certain things before the election.
Okay. So we're going to move to the group questions now. So we'll just take turns answering. Kate, I'll have you answer first. We saw a lot of hostility towards journalists on the Trump campaign trail, with it dipping into dangerous territories at times. So how do you think about safety in these times? How should students going into the field think about safety? Do you think we should worry about it on a physical level, or is it primarily just from a fake news contingent?
So for me personally, I mean, safety is something that I do think about more now, just because of the rhetoric, and also because there have been some, physical attacks on journalists in this country. There was, a pretty publicized one in, I think, Montana, and one in West Virginia. I mean, it is something that you have to be aware of, but also, I mean, that's something that journalists in other countries have faced for a really long time, and it's, I think people, if you're getting into this profession, it's something that, you should be aware of. But, and also in terms of the sort of fake news epithet, the one thing that I've really noticed, and I don't know if my fellow panelists would agree, but just that fake news insult, obviously it's something that gets said by the president, but it's certainly something that I think that has trickled down to politicians and elected officials at all levels. And I know I can think of at least one state representative that has used that, calling something fake news when it is in fact not fake, but it is true, and it is a story that is unflattering to that, individual personally. And so that's just something that, it's just obviously something that is in the atmosphere now, and that we have to be aware of. But we still, I mean, there's nothing that I can do about it. I just have to go out every day and do my job and report the news and double check everything, and be doubly sure, because our credibility is more important than ever. But so that is something that I have observed, I would say, in the last year.
I would like to add to that. I agree with all of those points. sometimes you think of, and I've been doing this for a long time, yeah, you think about safety sometimes, but I think, the fake news insult, as I will call it, it just basically, underscores how important our jobs are. And to me, journalists aren't going anywhere. Reporters aren't going anywhere. They're doing their job. There's no agendas. And, despite the noise or despite whether somebody tries to change the rules of engagement as a source, you just have to focus on that. And I think most of all of our colleagues are pretty good at doing that. And you sort of have to tune out the noise and keep in mind what your responsibility is as a journalist to your audience, which is to provide context, which is to put things into the proper perspective, which is to be accurate and which is to be fair. And so that's how it boils down. But I just think this climate just underscores how important this job is.
I would like to address that sort of as a professor, since that's what I've been doing for a number of years. I think it's a really good question you're asking. At Medill, we developed it wasn't a class really, but it was a module in a beginning class on being safe. It was in the same class as being ethical and being legal and a lot of other things. But I think one of the things that I would probably be doing these days if a student were going to cover a story where it might be politically contentious is make sure that they understood things like, don't let them take your camera away from you. I had a student that happened to, not in the current atmosphere, but from somebody who didn't like the fact that she was taking pictures of an event. But other than that, I think my two colleagues here have made really great points. I'd like to add one thing that's kind of related to this, which is that one thing that's happened in the past year, while we've been hearing about fake news and the failing New York Times and all those other things that the president likes to say, is journalism schools applications are up. And at Medill, where I taught, they're up 25%. And the students are writing things in their applications. I was talking to one of the professors the other day, like they're so concerned about this fake news thing, and they want to make sure that good, solid journalism is done and that good, trustworthy information is out there. And they went so far in some cases as saying they feel like they're defending democracy.
I would like to add one other thing. There is legislation pending in Congress right now called the Journalist Protection Act, which would increase penalties for anybody who would assault a journalist who's in the process of doing their job. So where that legislation goes, we'll see, but it is pending.
Do you think, again to all three of you, do you think that we'll be able to outgrow the fake news, era during this presidency, or is it something we'll have to live with for the next 2, possibly 6 more years?
Well, I don't know that it's, the fake news label obviously is, sort of, I feel like, everywhere now, and it's not just limited to this president, but another issue here is also how are people getting their news? And certain of the social media platforms that we use right now, are sort of more susceptible to, spreading information that is like highly partisan or not accurate. And so I wouldn't really want to just say that this problem is limited to one or more elected officials. It's also a problem of, the business model right now and just, certain, like I said, social media platforms as well.
Agreed. And I was just going to say, it's also an issue to me of critical thought. It's also an issue of how you process information or how people choose to process information or not to process information. If they're going to just subscribe to an ideology or a political stance and fail to or refuse to consider any alternative, which kind of flies in the face of how you think critically, I think that's a problem that we have too. That the opinion is fact kind of thinking. That a lot of people substitute, opinion for fact, and for whatever reason. And I think that feeds into this.
I think we should be careful about talking about things like the fake news era. I mean, one thing that's happened in the past year is that President Trump has been extremely successful at dominating the story of the day. It sometimes seems as if he does something to get attention, to draw attention from something else that maybe the newspapers were about to write about. So he keeps saying fake news. That doesn't mean it's a fake news era. But part of the problem that we've been dealing with, like these Russian trolls on Facebook and other things, is 82% of American adults get their news online. 61% get a lot of their news from social media. And what happens with social media or with conglomerate websites is that the brand is separated from the story. So if you go out and you buy a newspaper, like you buy Kevin's newspaper, you know it's the Erie Times News, and you know that it's a trustworthy publication. But if you're reading a social media site that has all these little tidbits from all over, what happens, I think, with a lot of young people, more than maybe than older people, is that they don't notice the source. They notice the content. And that's what I'm saying, that I'm encouraged that more journalism professors now are teaching news literacy to not just journalism students, but other students at the universities, so that they're teaching another form of critical thinking, right, as Kevin was pointing out.
Okay. Going along with that, yesterday there was the shooting at the YouTube headquarters, and someone on Twitter was screenshotting and keeping track of all of the fake stories that were trafficked at that time, just saying this person is the shooter, this person is the shooter. And when I went through it, there were probably over 100 posts of different people being accused as the shooter. So what are your tips on reporting an active shooter situation or any other information that would prompt misinformation?
There's a media literacy program called On the Media. It's like a WNYC show. They have something called the Breaking News Consumers Handbook or Guidebook that has some good tips for exactly those kind of situations. That if you Google On the Media, I think it's either Breaking News Consumer Handbook or Guidebook.
You mean so a news consumer can make judgments about what they're hearing or reading?
Yeah, and there's certain, unfortunately, with some of these situations, the same mistakes tend to get made over and over, and so that they've got a pretty good list of what to watch for.
I think probably you need to train young reporters too, or older reporters too, reporters of all ages, to not be so eager to jump on something they just heard somewhere. When it seems like social media is a broadcast medium that's happening at the moment of the news. And so the reporters themselves have to be careful to check their facts.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I use Twitter, to me, it's the same rules as I've used for 28 years. If I can't confirm it through usually multiple sources, I'm not tweeting it out. And that's basically, you just go from there.
Staying on this topic of social media, does a journalist have to live a frequently unhealthy lifestyle in which they always have to be on their phones? For example, if you miss a key email, text message, tweet, anything like that, you could potentially be losing out on a breaking quote-unquote story.
I like that question.
I just actually recently deleted the Twitter app off my phone because I felt like I was looking at it too much, and I mean, it's certainly good to be, in some ways, to be as connected as we are, but I mean, we can't like literally work all the time, and also, yeah.
And I think the longer you're in this business, you learn how to kind of strike those balances, with your personal life. Although I don't really think, and this is just the way I've always thought, I don't think you can. I'm always a journalist. There's always a notebook in my car. I could be going to my daughter's AAU basketball game, and if there's a crash on the side of the road, I'm going to stop and call somebody. And whatever. That you can't separate. That's part of who you are. It's, journalism kind of is one of those DNA jobs that it's part of who you are, but it doesn't mean it has to consume your life. And you can find balances, whether it's deleting an app off the phone, which I've done, or other ways to kind of rein that in.
So I've done the same thing. I took Twitter off my phone. And I used to use it. It used to be a useful news source. You used to be able to follow other journalists and see what was happening, but there was just too much anger on Twitter and too much irrationality. I think you just, with what both of you have said, I mean, you have to draw a line and preserve some time for yourself. Mm-hmm. And also resist I know that some news organizations have been encouraging their reporters to build their brands by being more active on social media. And I think, again, just control your own.
But I think you have to do that naturally too.
Yeah.
And it has to, the ebb and flow of it has to be something that doesn't come off as manufactured or fake, because I personally think people will see that. So, if you want to do that, you need to do it in a way that kind of flows naturally then.
Kevin, I'm actually really glad you said the word manufactured. I was going to talk about the Sinclair broadcast group video from last week. Have all of you seen it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So can we talk first about what the Sinclair broadcast group is? Is anyone?
Well, it's the largest broadcaster in the United States.
Correct.
Okay.
It's got a lot of
multiple television stations in different sized local news markets. Mm-hmm.
So for those of you who haven't seen the video, the website Deadspin last week put out this video of a bunch of local news organizations, and all of the anchors are saying the same exact thing. So what do you all think? Should we be scared of this same exact scripted message that they're all preaching about balanced journalism, even though a lot of them clearly are unbalanced? And what does it mean to have a script that is disseminated across such a wide broadcasting region?
Well, it was a script, and so that's the first thing to be concerned about, that so-called journalists are there to read a script from corporate headquarters, because I don't think any of us have ever done that as reporters. No. I think that's something to be concerned about if that is how Sinclair operates in covering the news, and I would hope that anyone in a Sinclair market would notice if they were listening to you or paying attention to your issues or your problems or your life, or just broadcasting some corporate point of view.
I agree with that. It's I certainly wouldn't want to be in that position as a journalist to have to read from a script. Like I said, in my career, I've written some stories that, people got indicted. I ended up on a witness stand, and I have never had anything dictated to me by anybody above me. And to the contrary, they've had my back, including providing a lawyer when you needed one. So, that is a scary proposition to be put in a position like that as a journalist, at least the way I see it.
I can just say quickly from personal experience, I had a great student at Medill who got hired by Sinclair shortly after graduation, got a great job. He was anchoring a newscast. And in a very short period of time, he quit because he said they weren't allowing him to be a journalist, that they were telling him what he had to say all the time.
And we have to be careful, and thank you for making that point. We have to be careful of getting out the brush and painting the whole, even broadcast industry or news industry or even components of it. That's not something any of us up here would want to deal with or condone, but we have to be careful about what this says. Does it speak to a larger context? We probably don't really know, but just keeping it in perspective is important too.
With this presidency, President Trump has epitomized the concept of Twitter as a newsmaker, continuously tweeting about his meetings and interactions, his instant reaction style of communication. Do you see that hurting White House coverage, given some news now is simply, President Trump tweeted this, President Trump tweeted that?
I don't want to dump it.
Well, I can't really speak so much to the White House, but just, generally speaking, just a politician making a statement, you know, it's still our job as journalists to provide context to that, to fact check that, to say, what does that mean going forward for this policy? And I know, you know, again, not so much addressing the president directly, but just politicians generally, I think, like social media because they feel like they can just directly say what their message is without it being filtered through something else. But, you know, there is certainly still a role for journalists to, like I said, provide context and check facts.
I guess I'm not out there covering the White House now, but I would just add that I think that President Trump is really good at dominating the conversation and dominating the topic of the conversation, and that his tweets tend to, you know, I know you hear journalists having conversations about the fact that we can't just talk about what he said today.
Right.
We have to go out and cover the news.
Well,
So-
and a big part of White House coverage now is basically vetting this information that he disseminates on Twitter.
Similar to that, cable news these days could certainly be described as toxic, as we were talking about the Sinclair thing. Given that clips of cable news shows often dominate social media, how do we prevent the cable news toxicity from coloring what people think every day about print journalism or even just specifically student journalism?
I'm not sure what you mean about cable news being toxic. Are you talking about certain cable broadcasters, or?
Yes, so like we have the very extreme CNN, Fox News, and a lot of times those clips get taken, doctored, edited to sound one way, and then the meaning is different.
On social media?
Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
I see. Sorry, I didn't understand.
No, that's okay.
Take it, Kevin.
Okay. I don't necessarily agree with that certain cable organizations by and large are toxic, in your words. And that's fine if that's how somebody wants to approach it. I think I've always thought that consuming news, there's a certain responsibility upon the consumer to be discerning, to be able to determine whether something is an opinion piece, whether it's explanatory, whether it's spot news, and I think that a lot of people don't do that. And I think in this age where there's more information available than ever before because of the internet, bad and reliable and unreliable, if you want to say it that way. To me, it's almost lazy not to discern what different types of news coverage are. I've said, my kids get into this conversation with me, and I said, a lot of people want to be spoon-fed, and then they want to complain about the spoon. You should be able to determine what all of these kinds of coverages are valuable in some context and in some respect, but you shouldn't lump them all together. There is no the media, because there's so much information and so many different outlets out there now that there is no all-encompassing thing that is covering news. And that should be to me, that should be readily apparent to people.
I think, too, as someone who spent my whole career in print, I know that, the truth is that the vast majority of people want to get their news on some kind of a screen now. And some of the news they're getting on the screen is the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Economist or something that has existed primarily in print. But I think that CNN does a great service with broadcasting around the clock the way it does, and I think broadcast news is really important to disseminating information, because remember, it doesn't matter what you want to say. It matters if anybody's listening, and if it means anything to your audience, if it's useful to your audience. So I think the fact that people are watching TV news means that TV is doing something important.
Okay. Earlier today, a state representative from Butler County tweeted at the editor-in-chief of the Slippery Rock student newspaper, and I'll read the tweet for everyone. "Having SRU in my district means I get to work with young college and journalists. They're the future. There is A-plus talent like at Haley Potter 2 and at Cozy Morgue. Then there is the, quote, editor-in-chief, end quote, of student blog and paper at Cody Nesper, SRU, who pushes a lib agenda and a horrible writer." So how would you handle that situation as the editor, and how would you tell the student to handle it?
Well,
if you were Cody, the person that he was tweeting at and referring to in the negative light, how would you handle that as a student journalist?
and was there a particular story that the representative was referring to that?
The editor-in-chief tweeted a week ago that being in Butler County with this specific state representative representing him was a shame. So it wasn't even a particular story. It was he was being criticized on Twitter and then came back with this today.
Well, I hope the student talked to his advisor, and I hope the advisor told him to get off Twitter and do his job.
Yeah. Yeah, it's often, well, all the time, it's a zero-sum game to get into battles with people on social media about your coverage or your content. I mean, you know, with Twitter, you get a lot of people that want to go back and forth and talk about stories. That's fine, but I'm not going to get into personal attacks or anything like that with someone, because you're going to be the reporter's going to be the loser in that situation all the time, and it's just not worth it.
I have to say, for a so-called grown-up and a state representative, to attack a student is shameful.
Yeah, I mean, without knowing the specifics of, what they were arguing about, I mean, I generally try to avoid getting into any kind of back and forth. I mean, it's up to, some people like to argue on Twitter, but I don't really find it productive or a good use of my time. And, but there, like I said, this is part of why I deleted it off my phone. There's a lot of negativity, and if it's sort of one of the things you have to wrestle with now, because there is a lot of pressure for journalists to be on Twitter and be active on Twitter, and a lot of reporters feel like they have to. But then, yeah, you sort of are subject to a lot of nastiness. So, yeah. Again, without really knowing the specific situation, I would just say, like, try to ignore it. But, I mean, there's what's the point in getting into an argument on Twitter, I guess.
Could I just add one thing? You mentioned at the beginning that you also wanted to talk about how technology is changing the way we work or consume news. There is no deadline anymore. I mean, newspapers used to have a daily deadline or sometimes a morning and an afternoon deadline, and every news organization had a certain sense of what its news day was. But now, if you think about the information that moves on social media and on various online sites, it's harder and harder to, let's say it's easier to become distracted. And it's, I think, more important than ever to sort of decide how you're going to spend your time. And if you think it's important to be on Twitter, then just decide that at maybe a certain time every morning at 7 o'clock you're going to tweet something about the news or something, and then go off for your day of work.
A follow-up to that question as well, talking about the state representative's tweet. As a student, I don't think we've necessarily, obviously there's not a specific class here at Edinboro about how to conduct yourself online, but one of the arguments that the student made was he tweeted it from his personal Twitter. So can you describe the importance, or I guess, even if there's a difference between your personal Twitter and your organization Twitter nowadays?
Well, a lot of, workplaces have rules about this. I mean, I guess there's sort of no difference, though, nowadays.
You mean between personal Twitter and official Twitter? Or?
Yeah,
I guess what I'm saying is, do you agree that what you tweet on your personal Twitter always comes back to represent you as a member of the organization,
Yes.
even if you
Yeah.
had no
It
intention
definitely-
of
yes.
doing so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's you
Yep.
writing publicly.
Have you had any situations with colleagues where they've tweeted something or they've put something on Facebook and then been asked to take it down, or had any disciplinary action because it came back to bite them later or negatively affect the organization?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of examples out generally of people getting fired over their tweets. So yeah, I think that people have to be mindful of that, and as you know, for you guys as students, it's definitely something that I think you should be aware that employers do, prospective employers do look at social media accounts, even, you know, what you might think is a personal social media account.
That's even of greater interest to
Yeah.
them. The first thing they
Correct.
do is Google you and see what you've been doing online. And some dumb thing you did in college at a party or something can lose you a job.
Yeah, you definitely need to be mindful of that. We just saw that at the beginning of this week with Dante DiVincenzo from Villanova. You know, people started looking up his Twitter account during the game, and stuff he posted in high school, you know, it ends up getting deleted because there's racial slurs and rap lyrics, and the digital legacy is a real thing, and everybody in here really needs to be aware and cognizant of that, because it's
And
important.
it never goes away.
No,
You can
and-
delete your account, but it's still out there.
Yep, I've got a son who's almost 19, a daughter who's almost 18, and a 13-year-old. And believe me, they've had this drilled into them for years, because it's, you know, it's going to follow you. So you need to be smart about those things.
Given President Trump's general mistrust of journalists, for those in the field, have you noticed that mindset trickling down at all to the individuals you interact with on a daily basis? The most powerful figure in the country attacks our profession most days of the week, so we're kind of in a unique position compared to other professions.
Kate, what do you think?
Well, you know, for me personally, going about doing my job, you know, I'm not at the White House. I'm interviewing people in Pittsburgh, and sometimes it's people who already know me, so they understand that I'm asking them questions because I'm doing my job, or, you know, in some situations, if it's someone that I don't know already, you know, perhaps I'm knocking on their door or calling them and introducing myself and saying, hey, I'm a reporter with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I mean, and most people respect that, and they understand that, okay, this person is knocking on my door or they're calling me to ask me some questions, and so they do want to hear what I have to say, and they're obviously not just making it up because they're here to talk to me. So, you know, for me personally, in most of my day-to-day interactions with regular, normal people, you know, it's not again, like just in my very narrow lane here, you know, it's not a problem. Now, I'm not saying it's not a problem generally that the president does this, but again, you know, because a lot of times in journalism, just that sort of face-to-face, you know, it's harder, it's sometimes hard for people to be rude to your face. But, so yeah, that's how I feel about it and how it's affected me.
I would agree with that. I think the people that I interact with daily in doing my job, a lot of them I've dealt with for a long time. Even if I encounter people that I haven't dealt with before, I don't really see a huge trickle down of the attitude. You see it more just in social media
Yeah.
and commentary on what you report. You don't see it as much with the sources. You see it more when it's a lot of times it's people that don't agree with what you're writing about, or don't want to accept maybe some of the facts that are components in what you write about. You see it. I see it more in commentary about the journalism you produce than in the actual sources you have to interact with.
And I would also add, you know, even if sometimes I'm talking to someone who is an elected official, or, you know, someone in government who maybe we're in a little bit of an adversarial situation, like I'm asking them a tough question, or I'm trying to, find out some information about what they did, most of the time they still have like a baseline understanding of what is the role of reporters and the role of a newspaper and the role of the press, and they're not, even if we're having a disagreement, they're not questioning that like broad framework of the role of journalism.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Because the people that have been around the block know that if they make it worse, it's just going to be another story. Seriously, I mean, it really will. I mean, if they blow up and snap on you, then that could become the story. So people that have been used to dealing with the press, kind of, whether they like what you're asking them or not, there is that kind of fundamental baseline level of the role understanding. So.
Okay. Is President Trump a particular breed to you, given he's been a celebrity for 30 plus years? He's dealt with the media, both tabloids, in legal trouble, and different lawsuits, or do you see him as part of a greater trend amongst politicians and public officials? Like, he's a fascinating figure, but how can we, what can he tell us about journalists and how others see journalists in the future?
He's one of a kind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
but I do think that trust in all institutions has been declining for decades, and including the press, and he has fixed on that to attack the press and present himself as the voice of the people. But you might.
No, I was just going to say I think. Thinking as a reporter, and if I were writing the story, to me the more relevant question is, what is his election or what is his ascendance tell us about ourselves, tell us about our nation? What, how, not so much, not even just how did this happen, but what were the components that opened the door for him, a political novice basically, even if he was a reality TV star or whatever, what are the components of that? And well, I think that's the fascinating question.
He did have an opponent.
Right.
That was part of the reason.
Yeah,
for
and
the
that's one of the components.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to jump to the Q&A section now. So given that this is a hot topic, I would ask that any questions or comments from the audience be respectful and foster an environment that is inclusive and engaging. So that being said, does anyone have any questions or comments? Yes.
Fake news, I feel, is really a new phenomenon. So you look back at the early 20th century, you have yellow journalism. What are some similarities between yellow journalism and fake news, and what are some differences in your guys' opinion?
Well, a lot of fake news is clickbait. The idea is to get you to click on it, and then one of the things they might get is advertising revenue. And that was definitely what was going on with yellow journalism. Say something that will outrage people and draw attention and get them to buy more copies of the paper. So that's one analogy, I think.
It's a similar concept, absolutely.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
You were talking about how there is no deadline. Do you think that the main deadline is to get your company to get the honest content out there to everyone first?
Sorry, could you sort of restate that maybe?
Yeah. When you're talking about how there's no deadline, do you think the main deadline is to make sure that your company gets the most honest content out to everyone first?
So the question for those of you who didn't hear is, we said that earlier there was no deadline. So is the main deadline I'm sorry, Christina, one more time? Just the last part.
To get your company to have someone have the most honest content out there.
Okay, to have the company have the most honest content out there first.
So that's a question about your company, I guess, and your company. Right?
Well, that there's no deadline. I mean, because when I first started in this job, the deadline, I couldn't put some news online in the middle of the day.
Right.
That wasn't something that used to happen. So the deadline was in the evening when we would file our stories that would go in the paper in tomorrow morning's newspaper. So that was like deadline was like one time at night. And so, but now we can put anything online at any time of the day or night. So the sense of like there being one deadline a day we don't have that anymore. So I think, and yes, of course, we always want to be first in like a breaking news situation, although we also want to be correct. But yeah, so that's sort of, I think, what people mean when they say there's no deadline, is because it used to be like one set time, and that does not exist anymore.
And the multi-platform nature of what's going on is part of the reason for that. Like, like Kate said, when I started in this business, I wasn't writing 3 or 4 versions of the same story in a day. When you encompass, the online story. Now I'll go to a city council meeting and, tweet from it and take pictures and shoot a video on my phone and come back and write a story for GoErie.com before noon. And there's still going to be a version of that story that runs in the paper for the next day. And sometimes with breaking stories, you have to update them. And that's the difference in our business now. So you kind of have to have that mindset.
Okay. I believe I saw a hand up here. Yes.
Earlier, you guys mentioned that we should all be, checking our sources to make sure they're reputable. Outside that, what else should, we as Americans be doing to make sure that our sources that we're looking at are reputable to use in everyday conversation?
Okay, so the question was, earlier we talked about how we need to fact check to make sure sources are reputable. So as Americans, what else can we do to, in addition to fact checking, to make sure the sources are reputable?
So you mean like as a consumer?
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, oh, okay, good.
Well, everyone should buy their local newspaper and read their local newspaper because that's, I would argue the best, going to be the best source for local news and news about your community and where you live is probably your local newspaper. And, I think it's just from a consumer perspective, it's great to have multiple sources of news, not just one, but, more than one.
Agreed. I think, and it goes back to a point I tried to make earlier, was that as a consumer of news, information, whatever you want to call it, you should want to be informed, which means going to a lot of different sources for that information, which is challenging yourself to read and research things that may run contrary to your own personal points of view. Things like that. That's how you truly become informed about topics.
And I guess one more thing I would add is don't just sort of passively click on what is coming before you in your Facebook or Twitter or social media feed. I would say get out of that. Go to a news, go to the website of the organization itself, or even buy a newspaper. But don't just sort of, because if you're in Facebook or in certain other social media sites, I know it feels like you're choosing the news, but there's sort of algorithms at work there that are determining what you see. And then when you click on that, that's sort of, you're more likely to see things like that. So I would say just leave that bubble of social media and go outside of that also.
There are a lot of respected news organizations at all levels, and sometimes it's a neighborhood news, a hyper-local neighborhood news outlet, but I would agree totally with what you said. Go to the source.
Dr. Thompson?
It's a very well timed, as there's an editorial out in the New York Times tonight about Trump's use of fake news and how that's spreading around the world to be used by would-be dictators around the globe. But do you see it, the attacks on journalism, and especially the attacks on the credibility of journalists, do you see it as a threat to civil discourse in the short term and the long run? And do you see it as potentially participating in a dumbing down of critical debate in America?
Okay.
I do.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to
I do. I mean, I think Carl Bernstein used a phrase many years ago, the assumption of regularity, talking that when you're interviewing government officials, you kind of assume that there's a regular order of things, and that they're going to know, I would say now you might have an assumption of competence, you know, do they know their job? Do they understand you're doing your job? But I think that he has literally called the press the enemy of the people. Mm-hmm. He has literally referred to Mein Kampf as a great book. I mean, this is a threat to public discourse, and I think that as a citizen, it really bothers me, you know, that, so I think it is a problem.
It always concerns me as a journalist, as somebody that cares about this profession, as an American. Like I said at the beginning, it just, to me, it underscores how important the job that we do is, because if you look, you know, I don't like to use absolutes and throw blankets and that kind of thing, but I will say much of, if not most of, the real things you know about this administration are because of journalism. And it's not because they told you, because they just wanted to volunteer that information. It's because of damn good journalism. And I just hope and wish that more people would recognize that and connect those dots in terms of what we do. I'm not trying to soapbox, so I'll be done in a second. But why what we do is so important to society, because there it is.
Yes.
You mentioned how, like, as a journalist, getting your content out to the most amount of people is very important. So, like, from a journalist perspective, the increase in, like, social media news, is that more good or harmful towards, like, journalism as a whole?
So the question was, is social media news, since you can tweet so quickly, is that harmful or beneficial to journalism?
I don't think it's necessarily harmful if the consumer, like had been mentioned before up here by a couple of us, if the consumer can differentiate between the sources and understand where that information comes from. It didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was that content was produced by someone. So do your due diligence to find out, you know, where that content came from and how reliable it is.
Yes.
In what most people I would suspect consider kind of a need now society, seeing as journalism is ultimately a business and the purpose of it is, at the end of the day, to kind of check and pay your employees, do you think that this mentality that people want something, they want it now, they want a product immediately, do you think that has had an effect on journalists essentially being a little more lax on fact checking and such, and just trying to push the product out as fast as they can to just satisfy the people?
So is the instant gratification society affecting how journalists do their work, and if it makes them lazy with fact checking, right? Okay.
No, because I would, you know, I think we don't want to get sued either, which is another, you know, which is, that's what people don't understand. I tell students a lot of times when I talk to them is, you know, we work in one of the very few, there are other professions, but where the world can critique your work every day. What you do, you know, I mean, if you work in an insurance agency, nobody's looking over your shoulder at how you filled out these reports. Not saying that, I mean, it isn't coming down on any other agency, but you, as a journalist, you don't run from that responsibility. You actually embrace it. You know, so I don't buy that journalists as a whole. I understand. Believe me, I'm a union president. I understand all this stuff and constraints of you know, the business side of journalism and these kinds of things, but that the economics are somehow contracting journalism to a point where people are getting lazier, I would not buy that for a second.
I mean, journalists always want to be first with the news. I mean, everyone loves a scoop.
Right.
And I'm not saying nobody ever made a mistake,
right.
But I think, you know, everyone I work with still really cares about getting it right. And also, I think we know that if we do make a mistake, then that spreads very quickly, you know, something that's wrong. So I think that, you know, people still work very hard to make sure they're getting everything correct.
Well, and that's why in journalism, if you make a mistake, you own it too. You know, you explain it to the public, you run a correction, and you deal with that. And in a lot of news dissemination businesses or outlets, that does not happen. You know, they just get hung out there. And that's one of the things that with this administration, there are tweets all the time that are factually inaccurate. They don't get corrected. But you know, journalists correct their mistakes and own their mistakes, and when want to do the job the right way for the public. And you know, if you do make a mistake, you own it.
Yes.
I had a quick question, and it's not so much in terms of how journalism is affected in the age of Trump, but in your experience. I hope it's coherent because I'm not a journalist student, but one of the things you said, you specifically covered the Pittsburgh and Allegheny area.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I follow politics kind of for fun, and one of the things that is kind of noted are in the special elections, Vern Moore and Doug Jones being local. More specifically, I wanted to know, how did Connor Lamb, how did you cover that? And more specifically, do you see the special elections being won by candidates that generally shouldn't be winning in those areas or districts as traditional pendulum swing? We have a conservative in the White House, now we have to swing back, or is this kind of a direct repudiation of that type of attitude?
Okay, so the question was, are special elections pendulums where if there's a conservative in the White House, people want to go the other way? Or is it just people vote how they want to? And how did you cover specifically the Connor Lamb election in your area?
Well, so I think the second part of your question is maybe more of a politics question that I'm not super well equipped to answer. But let me just point out, though, regarding that special election in the 18th district, if people aren't familiar with it, I just want to point out the reason why there was a special election is because the sitting congressman, Tim Murphy, had to resign because my colleague, Paula Ward, uncovered basically a scandal about Tim Murphy, which he, I don't know how closely you followed this, made a lot of news. He was a pro-life congressman, and he was having an affair, and he asked his mistress to get an abortion. And so that is why he had to resign in the middle of his term. And this would not have come about, the election would not have come about in the first place if it weren't for my colleague doing her job, getting a tip, going down to the courthouse, realizing like, oh, this hearing is sealed. Why is that? And you know, doing some digging. She worked really hard on that story. It did not get handed to her. She really dug in, and that is why there was a special election in the first place. So just want to toot the horn of my colleague and my news organization there, and just sort of, you know, that sort of shows, I think, again, the importance of journalists doing their jobs. So, but the politics thing, I'm not the best person to answer that, but it was definitely considered an upset.
Well, and again, that race is one where if you go back in as a journalist, you're gonna get as close to the ground as possible and talk to people about. I mean, that was an area that I believe Trump won by 20-some points a couple years ago. So, you know, as a journalist, you want to look at the components there, and you want to talk to people and say, what were the factors that could come up with this much of a swing? Was it? I mean, some of what happened with Murphy is obviously a factor in there, but that's how I would approach it if I were trying to do a story on that.
Yes, sir. Go ahead. In the front.
Combine the last two questions. First of all, on the revenue issue, and then on the special election and the reporter's work. Is this an era that's actually good for journalism? Has subscriptions grown? Is there more advertising? Do do you get more revenue to pursue stories? It may not be a slippery slope disaster. We might be just on a rocky road to improvement.
There has been a lot of good investigative journalism done in the last year. News organizations have, you're an IRE winner, that's investigative reporters, have invested more in it. I mentioned that journalism schools are seeing a big uptick because young people believe journalism matters.
I think that organizations now, when you talk about, I mean, a lot of us know that the business model, especially in print journalism, has its challenges and has had its challenges. I think that makes it more important for organizations to communicate internally and figure out what is it that you do that no one else can do. What is your value to your community? What do you provide that nobody else around you can give the readership or your audience? You know, not just readers, because we're multi-platform now as a newspaper. I think that's what news organizations have to do these days, is figure out what their value is to their consumers and focus their content on that.
Part of the larger problem, though, is just that, you know, as fewer and fewer people subscribe to the print product, and it's very hard to replace those lost advertising dollars via online advertising and clicks. Basically, the essential problem is that, you know, it's pennies on the dollar in terms of advertising. And even if a lot of people come to your website, it's still really hard to make money off of a news website. And that's sort of the essential problem that hasn't been fixed. And it's not a problem of people not coming to us for their news. It's just a problem of the advertising model has changed, and we haven't figured out how to make enough money off of online yet. And when I say we, I don't mean like where I work specifically. I mean the general, the business.
Okay, so we'll take 3 more questions. So yes.
What advice would you give to new journalists and student journalists going into this field when they're applying for jobs and internships so that they don't get sucked into this cycle of scripted news or maybe working with a source that isn't the most credible? Because when you think about the journalists that were part of the Sinclair media thing, I don't think that they probably applied for this job and accepted it and, you know, knew that they were going to be pushed to say this scripted piece, you know? So what advice would you give to students to watch out for that, or if they're put in that situation, what they should do?
So the question is, what advice would you give to younger journalists and student journalists who want to avoid being sucked into the scripted corporate Sinclair Broadcasting Group kind of net?
Talk to your professors, for one thing, about what would be a good place to apply to, what would be a good place to work, what would be a bad place to work. I think that I would say that the people at Sinclair who were shown in that video have been reading scripts for a long time. They were senior people. They weren't beginners. And I would say too that as a young journalist, in a way you're a nation of one. I mean, you're responsible for what you do. And you want to find news organizations to work with who share your values.
Yep. That's what I was going to say, was going to hit on, you know, professional value system, developing that and being true to it, and yep, you know.
Yeah, I mean, without saying any of the specifics there, I mean, certainly if you feel like you're asked to do something unethical, yeah, if you have like a trusted professor or an advisor that you can talk to, that would be really valuable to have as a student.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
So many of the things that happen in this administration are so insane that they're funny. And my question is, comedians like John Oliver, Stephen Colbert, Samantha Bee, how would you say that satire and comedy now play a role in journalism today in the Trump era?
how do satire and comedy play a role in journalism today in the Trump era?
Well, a lot of people get their news from those sources.
Yeah. Young people especially.
Yeah, definitely. Again, and not to sound like the broken record, but as long as you kind of develop that sense and that eye to be able to discern, to put that in its proper context as what it is, as opposed to an opinion piece in the New York Times or a straight news story or investigative story in the Wall Street Journal or Politico or somewhere else about something going on in the administration. As long as you as the news consumer can see the differences there, that's what's important.
Okay. And last question? Yes.
As a young journalist, sometimes I feel like our profession is lost cause because in the 2016 election, Harambe got 15,000 votes. I guess my point is, if we're making such an impact now, then how could something like that have happened? I mean, looking back on it, it's a joke, but it's not really a joke because those are so many lost votes. And so much information lost.
So your question, correct me if I'm wrong, is since so many people voted for Harambe in the 2016 election, how do we avoid that going forward? Or how, I'm sorry, I don't think I understand.
How could that have happened, I guess, if journalism in the age of Trump is more prominent than it once was, I guess?
Okay, so if journalism is less prominent than it used to be, more prominent. More prominent than it used to be.
Sorry, the question, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Can you explain it one more time without using Harambe, maybe? Just, I think that's the part that we're all stuck on.
I guess what I'm getting at is, are people taking us seriously?
Journalists?
Right.
Are people taking journalists
Well,
seriously?
because people voted for like a joke candidate.
Right.
I mean, I would interpret that more as like a commentary on the political system and the choices that are available than on journalism. I mean,
At the end of the day, they don't have to take you seriously. They have to take what you write seriously.
Right.
If you are doing stories about the things that matter to them, they're going to pay attention to your journalism. But they don't. We're sort of a blue collar profession. You don't have to get a license to be a journalist. You don't get paid very much. So I wouldn't be discouraged.
No.
Even if you feel, very upset about the presidential election, it's only one presidential election. We have one every 4 years. Go out there and do your job.
Yeah. Go cover that one and put the context to it and explain to people why the results happen the way that they happen, whether it be as an institution or as watchdogs or whatever you want to call it. I mean, journalists aren't going anywhere. It's just not happening. So the platforms may change or tweak or those kind of things, but like I said, most of what you really know about this administration, about what's been going on in Washington, it's because of journalism. It's not because someone volunteered to tell you, especially if there's dicey kind of things. So, you got to keep the faith on that. That's got to be part of the mindset that you have if you want to go into and stay in this profession. So.
All right, well, thank you so much all for being here. Thank you three for being here. Could we have a round of
No
applause? I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that was extremely informative having three professionals in here talking about their experiences. So thank you so much.
Good
Pleasure to be
questions.
here.
Thank you, everyone.
Good
pleasure to be
questions.
here.